Most people don't realize this, but there's a version of the smart Social Security strategy where you can go years without collecting a single dollar, even though you were fully eligible the entire time. And not just a short delay either. In some real-life situations, that gap can stretch out close to a decade, while the benefit you eventually receive doesn't meaningfully improve the outcome the way you expected it would. That might sound extreme at first, almost like an edge case that wouldn't apply to most people, but it usually begins with advice that feels completely reasonable on the surface. You hear it online, you hear it from friends, sometimes even from professionals. Wait as long as possible, aim for age 70, maximize your monthly check. On paper, that logic holds together. It looks disciplined, it feels responsible, and it's easy to follow. But once you start layering in real life, your health, your savings, your family situation, that clean logic begins to shift in ways people don't always see coming. And the part of the strategy that feels the safest, the most widely accepted, can turn out to be the least complete piece of the entire decision. The entire decision often begins with a number that feels familiar, almost comforting in its simplicity. 79, the average life expectancy in the US. It shows up in articles, charts, and conversations, and over time, it quietly becomes an anchor in people's thinking. From there, a subtle assumption starts to form in the background. If that's the average, then maybe planning far beyond it isn't necessary, or at least not something to take too seriously. But that number doesn't actually mean what most people think it means. It's calculated at birth, which means it includes every possible risk someone faces long before retirement even enters the picture. By the time you've made it into your early 60s, you've already moved past a large portion of that uncertainty. You're no longer starting from zero. At that point, your real expectation isn't 79 anymore. It's often another 20 or more years, sometimes even longer, depending on your health and family history. And once you see it that way, the baseline shifts. The timeline stretches out, and the decision starts to feel different. But even when people adjust for that, when they realize they may live longer than they initially assumed, they still don't quite land in the right place. Because this decision was never just about how long you live. It feels like it should be, but there's more happening beneath the surface. And this is where another layer starts to come into focus, one that almost never shows up on those clean Social Security charts people rely on. Because while those charts compare what you receive at 62 full retirement age and 70, they quietly ignore something that's just as important, where your income is actually coming from during the years you choose to wait. If you delay your benefit, your need for income doesn't pause with it. Life keeps moving. Bills still show up, groceries still need to be bought, and that income has to come from somewhere, which usually means drawing from your portfolio earlier than you otherwise would. At first, that might not feel like a big deal. After all, that's what the portfolio is there for. But over time, something subtle begins to unfold. Every dollar you take out today is a dollar that no longer has the chance to grow, to compound, to quietly build on itself over the next 10, 15, or even 20 years. So what looks like a simple trade waiting now to receive a larger check later starts to carry an invisible cost in the background. And once you start to account for that cost, the comparison shifts. It's no longer just about Social Security versus Social Security. It becomes a much broader question about timing, growth, and opportunity. That's where the idea of a clean break-even point somewhere around 80 or 81 starts to lose its sense of certainty. Because that number only holds if everything else in your financial life stays untouched, and in reality, that almost never happens. Once your portfolio enters the picture, the timeline begins to move in ways that aren't obvious at first glance. If collecting earlier allows more of your investments to remain in place, continuing to grow quietly in the background, then the advantage of waiting has to work harder just to catch up. And over time, that fixed break-even point isn't so fixed anymore. In some situations, it starts to drift into your mid-80s, or even beyond, depending on how those withdrawals and returns interact over the years. At that point, the question shifts. It's no longer just about whether you live long enough to justify waiting. It becomes a deeper question about whether the math you're relying on ever told the full story in the first place. If you've ever looked at one of those Social Security charts and felt like the answer was obvious, this is probably the point where it stops being so clear. So, before going further, it's worth pausing for a second and thinking about your own situation. Would you still make the same decision knowing these trade-offs exist beneath the surface? Now consider a situation that doesn't show up on most charts, but once you see it, it's hard to ignore. You're 62, your spouse is 92, and both of you qualify for the maximum benefit of $4,875 per month at age 70. Following conventional advice, you decide to wait. It feels like the responsible move. But let's say your spouse lives another 8 years reaching 100. During that time, you collect nothing even though you were eligible the entire time. Then your spouse passes, and you step into a survivor benefit that effectively mirrors what you were waiting for anyway. The final number looks the same, but the path to get there is completely different. 8 years of income gone. And situations like this don't just affect you. In some cases, your decision also determines whether other benefits even exist. If you have minor children, they may qualify for benefits, but only for a limited window. Waiting too long doesn't delay that benefit, it removes it. The same idea can apply to your spouse. In many cases, they can't access certain benefits until you file. So your delay becomes their delay whether that was your intention or not. At that point, the decision stops being purely personal. It becomes something that ripples outward, affecting more than one timeline, more than one set of needs. And sometimes all of this analysis runs into a much simpler reality. You might not be choosing between good and better. You might be choosing between taking Social Security at 62 or taking on high-interest debt just to get by. When that's the trade-off, the equation changes. Avoiding a smaller benefit matters less than avoiding a growing financial burden. In that situation, claiming early isn't a failure to optimize, it's a way to stay stable. There's also more flexibility in this decision than most people realize. In certain cases, you can start benefits early, use that income when you need it, and then suspend your benefit later, allowing it to grow again. That option doesn't apply to everyone, but it changes how you think about timing. Instead of one fixed decision, it becomes something you can adjust as your circumstances evolve. So when someone says, just wait until 70, it's not that they're wrong. It's that they're only looking at part of the picture. Because once you factor in your health, your portfolio, your family, and your real financial situation, the answer stops being universal. It becomes personal. And before you follow what sounds like the smartest rule, it's worth asking yourself one simple question. Are you following a guideline, or are you making the decision that actually fits your life?